We start in Venezuela, where the electoral authority says President Nicolás Maduro has been re-elected for a third term. Here he is addressing his supporters after the result was announced. According to the official count, based on 80% of the ballots, Mr Maduro won about 5 million votes, compared with some 4 million for the main opposition candidate, Edmundo González. The Venezuelan opposition are alleging widespread fraud in the counting of votes. Our correspondent, Ione Wells, has the latest from Caracas.
Well, these results have just come in, and effectively the electoral authorities are saying that President Maduro has won a third term in office. They announced that with 80% of the votes counted, President Maduro had won about 5 million of the votes, and the opposition candidate Edmundo González had won about 4 million of the votes. Now, these results are likely to be widely disputed by the opposition prior to the results being announced by the Electoral Council, who is controlled by the government and by President Maduro. The opposition were claiming widespread fraud in this election. Their particular concern was around the fact that their election observers were barred or removed in some cases from some of the election counts around the country. They said that the receipts that are printed from some of the electronic voting machines around the country weren't delivered. They haven't been able to receive some of those. They said they'd only had access to about 30% of those physical receipts showing what the results were from the electronic machines. And their concern was that this means the results were submitted electronically, and that could leave things more open to be tampered with. Now, that is something that is disputed heavily by the government. President Maduro has said that these results have been fair, but the big question now is whether the international community recognise this result, whether they recognise his government after the last elections were widely dismissed as neither free nor fair, and how the opposition decide to react now. Because in the build-up to this, in the opinion polls, the opposition were well ahead. They were widely expected to gain the majority of votes, judging by some of the opinion polls published before this election. And I think they will not want to concede defeat, given the result that has been announced by the official authorities.
So they're likely to challenge this result. As you say, we're waiting for the response from the international community to this as well. So really it's a waiting game now, is it, to see what happens in the next 24 hours or so?
That's right, and there are a lot of unknowns about what could happen next. Certainly after the last election in 2018, which was also widely dismissed as being neither free nor fair, protests broke out around the country, and sanctions were imposed by the US, hitting in particular Venezuela's oil sector. So there is a question now, as I say, about how both the international community respond, but also how the opposition responds here in Venezuela. There was a lot at stake in this election. The economy has been in free fall for a decade. Millions of Venezuelans have fled the country, nearly 8 million in total, many of whom have emigrated to the US. And there are concerns among those who wanted change, who wanted a vote for a different government, about what now happens to the country in general.
With me to discuss the results is Mimi Swaby. So, Mimi, the opposition were actually leading in the polls beforehand, before the results came through. What's been the reaction on the ground so far?
We've just heard the public face of the opposition coalition, Maria Corina Machado, saying that we won and everyone knows it. It was by so overwhelmingly a lot. It was so big in every sector of the country. She said that Edmundo González, the candidate who faced President Maduro, that he won by 70% of the votes, and they've denounced fraud. They're not going to accept Maduro's win lightly. Maduro is now celebrating his third 6-year term. But people aren't happy. They've called, or the opposition have called, their supporters to go peacefully into the streets. However, we haven't seen a peaceful demonstration so far. This has been an election from start to finish with high emotions, high tensions, and those aren't going to be dissipated anytime soon, as people, the majority of people in the streets right now, are really unhappy with how this result turned out.
What about the international community? We heard that EU observers were sent to oversee the elections, although they weren't allowed to do their job. We heard from Secretary of State Antony Blinken saying they're going to follow them closely. What's the international community said so far about the result? results?
Well, even before the results were announced, during the counting, during the voting, observers were saying that this wasn't a level playing field. There were conditions which very clearly favoured Nicolás Maduro to win his third term. Internationally, people, especially in the region, have been very vocal. The president of Chile, Gabriel Boric, said this is really hard to believe. Argentina's president, Javier Milei, said his country will not accept another fraud. So people aren't going to let Nicolás Maduro take his third presidency very easily. There will be many reactions still to come, and a lot of people are saying that this was an open secret. Everybody knew he was going to win one way or the other, by hook or by crook, as he said, and he even warned of a possible bloodbath and civil war. So this is a very volatile situation on the global scale, but especially in Venezuela at the moment. Even a bit further south in Argentina, we've seen Venezuelans going to the embassy in Buenos Aires, the capital of Argentina, hitting, kicking, throwing things at the embassy, really showing, venting their frustration at a result that so many people were hoping could be the change that Venezuelans were looking for. There are around 7.6 million Venezuelans who fled the country during this economic crisis that has been grappling the country, suffering the country during Maduro's reign, if you say. Many people were hoping that the opposition were going to be the people who allowed families to be reunited, to allow people to return, but that at the moment isn't going to be the case.
I mean, you mentioned the diaspora there. A lot of them, I read today, weren't even able to vote, even though they tried. I wanted to ask you what we should expect to see in the coming days in Venezuela.
The opposition have said they will not accept this result easily. They're going to stand very steadily and fast against Maduro, saying that people go into the street peacefully, like I said, to show that the population won't accept this result either. Edmundo Gonzalez said he won by 70%. That is a huge difference to the 44% of the votes that, according to the government-run electoral system, he's been given. There won't be an easily accepted defeat or win here. People are going to really show their frustration in multiple ways in the country, outside the country, because this is one of the most united oppositions we've seen in 25 years. And there were so many high expectations running up to this election, and especially on Sunday. The opposition even called their voters to stay in the polling centres to watch the votes being counted, as they were so aware of the conditions against them, but also so aware how important, how vital and pivotal this election was. So emotions are still going to be running high, and I'm sure we will see a lot more developments in the coming hours, coming days.